What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to show you how to find bass in no man's land. These are basically areas where the fish are just kind of roaming out in open water. They're oftentimes hard for anglers to decipher and figure out. But I'm going to show you what these areas look like on Google Earth as well as a contour line map so you can dial them in and put a bunch of fish in the boat. Before we get into that though, I would really appreciate it if you guys went and subscribed to the Fish the Moment podcast. We upload all of the audio from these videos to the Fish the Moment podcast, along with audio from our Fish the Moment content and some of our past Fish the Moment episodes. We've also been uploading the audio to these lake breakdown videos, and we haven't got a lot of feedback on whether you like that style of content as a podcast. You don't get the visuals along with what I'm talking about, but we really appreciate if you sent us some feedback at info@fishthemoment.com or by commenting down below. So let me know what you think of the podcast. Now back to the video. Okay, so what do I mean by no man's land areas? Well, if we go to this lake here and then take the lake down where it's below normal pool on Google Earth Pro, what we can find is that we have a nice big flat here, and then there's some random creeks that cut in here, and the bass can sometimes spread all around this area. Sometimes they'll be on the bank and stuff like that, but especially in the fall, these fish are going to be sitting up in what a lot of anglers would consider no man's land, and they'll just be randomly roaming and cruising through these areas. And it can be pretty challenging to actually dial these fish in these zones. And there's really two approaches I take to finding fish that are in no man's land. The first is to target them using forward-facing sonar, I know everyone's favorite topic, and basically finding bait fish that are in the middle of these bays and creeks and even just on these flats and chasing those fish around with forward-facing. But that's not really that productive of a strategy if you don't have forward-facing, and it's really only applicable if you can do that. And it's not that complicated either. Just get in these areas, find the bait fish, and then follow the bait fish around until you see fish on the screen, throw at them, catch them. Not that complicated. But if you don't have forward-facing, you have to be a little bit more tactical with your approach and also a little more strategic. And what I like to do is basically find these areas where these fish can push up to shallower water and feed. So even though the bass might just be roaming in these, no man land area, in this random creek, on this big random flat, there's always going to be places where these bass are going to set up and try to ambush bait. Even while they're chasing them around and things like that, at times they want to hide behind an object or behind a piece of cover and use it as an ambush zone. They don't want to chase all day long. And so my normal strategy is to get into a big flat like this, and this little creek could be it, but it could just be literally any of these big flats, these big flat areas with nothing really going on. And what I'm trying to do is first graph through these areas, and we'll transition over to a contour map to show you what this looks like as well on like a contour map situation. So this is the same creek. You can see these little creek channels that run through here. Really, it looks like a lot less interesting here on the map than it even does on the Google Earth, but it's just a big flat. There's really nothing going on out here, but a lot of times these bait fish will just roam randomly out here. So what I'll do is I'll get into this general big flat area here. Now I'm just going to graph until I start seeing a lot of bait fish. I want to see a ball of bait fish about every 5 to 10 seconds on my down imaging or 2D sonar. This lets me know there's a good quantity of bait fish in the area, and usually there's going to be a zone where there's going to be more bait fish than the other part of this big no man's land area. You don't want to get too much bait though, so let's say you get into this little flat here and there's bait fish popping on your screen, and there's like 10 bait balls on the screen, and you see a bait ball pop up every 2 or 3 seconds on the screen. That's too much bait fish. You really want a bait ball popping up every 5 to 10 seconds, but not all the time and not like once per minute. You kind of need to hit that little threshold between the two. But once you've identified that, and we'll go back to kind of Google Earth and mark out an area based on what we just talked about. So let's say that for whatever reason, this stretch right here is where the majority of the bait fish are. So you have that stretch. So we know that these bass are just kind of randomly roaming around chasing shad on this area. Well, what I like to do is I like to basically know that at some point those bait fish and the bass are going to intersect with some type of cover or some type of object, some undulation or drop off or things like that. And a lot of times what you can do is just really dissect these areas with either Google Earth Pro if the lake is drawn down, or just with graphing with your side imaging, down imaging, things like that, and finding all the objects that are here. So we're going to mark all those objects, and basically what we can see is we have a few interesting things. One are some big stumps, and we talked about this in our last lake breakdown video, which is fishing these isolated stumps for big fish. So this is a really good like big fish type of cover. So we're going to mark this stump. Now I'm going to mark all this stuff just to kind of give you an idea. Again, you can do this on Google Earth, transfer these waypoints over using my video. I'll link in the description. You can transfer these waypoints straight to the fish finder, or you can do this with your graph. Just graph with side scan and mark all these things. So we have these random stumps out here. I'm not going to mark every single one, but like we got these stumps like that. And then we also have a little grouping of stumps over here. There we go. My mouse is acting up a little bit, so bear with me. And then on top of that, we have a nice little road bed. So obviously this road bed looks really good. And we also have a culvert. So this culvert right here is definitely going to attract some bait fish, some fish. So we can mark that culvert right there. And then we have this nice road right here. So maybe these fish are even just setting up along this road. So we could drop a dozen waypoints down that if we wanted. We have a nice rock slab right here. So this rock slab looks really nice. So we could just call that rock. And then we also have all of those lay down logs. So, I mean, this is a really nice setup where you have a lot of stuff going on. And these are just random lay downs and sticks. There's more stuff to mark. And all of these little areas, I mean, if I went to this area, the things I'd be marking are these stumps or this little like gap in this pond levee right here. If we go further up, again, there's random metal, or I keep saying metal, random rock slabs. There's another culvert. There's stuff all over the place to mark. But just because there's stuff there, if there's not bait fish and fish there, it doesn't matter if there's a culvert or if there's this old house foundation or whatever. It really matters if there's the proper amount of bait fish. So this stretch here, even though it has similar elements to the others, is potentially better just because the bait fish happen to be here. Whether that's because the wind really pushed in this direction or the bass are just in that zone in that day. And this zone I marked could move from here to over here the next day, and they can move over here. Because these fish are in that no man's land, and they're just chasing those bait fish around. Those bait fish can move from this zone and be really stacked up, and then be over here the next day, and then be over here 2 days later, just based on the wind and things like that. So in the fall, it can get a little bit tricky. But once you have all these things marked, and let's say that the lake is back up at like kind of semi-normal pool for the fall, you have all this stuff marked. And what you can do is you can start rolling around these areas, targeting these stumps, this bigger area, this little culvert with the road bed, more of these little stumps, and that big rocky spot. And what I would do is I would have these waypoints on my fish finder if I didn't have forward facing, and I would basically just start my boat basically here, and I would work my way around, and my path of my boat would basically be like starting here, and I would work down this, and then I would go to here. And wherever that red line is, that's where my boat's going, and I'm going to be basically targeting this area using a moving bait. So a couple of options that work really well obviously are going to be like a deep diving crankbait or a shallower diving crankbait depending on the depth. You can also fish some type of jerk bait to work the middle of the water column if you feel like the fish are suspended up a little bit. You can throw a swim bait, just put a little swim bait in a jig head and work through this area around these objects. And then also once you get to like a really nice patch of stumps or that little culvert, you can even drag a jig around. And what you've now done is you've developed a milk run of spots, and at times when there's a lot of shad in the area, you can go back and forth on this deal, trying different baits, trying one pass with a crankbait that digs the bottom, next pass with a jerk bait or a swim bait that's in the middle of the water column, so on and so forth. And depending on the situation, every time you pass through here, you might pick up 2 or 3 more fish. Because the bait fish are roaming and moving in these areas. They're not necessarily setting up like on these rocks or these stumps on any given moment. The reason you might catch them off these though is that the bait fish are swimming around and they happen to be over here and the bass happen to be over here, and when those bait fish start coming by, they kind of set up for a few minutes in the shadow of these stumps. I'll take the lake back down just to show you like the shadows of those laydowns. And in that moment that you pull up, you'll catch 3 or 4 fish, not because necessarily they're just loaded on there all day. Your group of fish that's roaming this flat happens to intersect with the object that you are marking, and these are good ambush areas. If you're trying to, jump out and scare someone, you want to like hide behind an object, hide behind a couch, or hide behind a door, or like hide under the table and then jump out and scare them. Same thing with the fish feeding. They want to be setting up behind some type of object or around some type of object. And even if they don't want to set up like on, the backside of a stump or something, they still want a place where they can ambush those bait fish down into a harder bottom area. Having a rocky slate bottom or like the top of this roadbed, it's a lot more advantageous for those fish to feed on a hard bottom rather than the silty bottom, because when they ambush those bait fish down onto the bottom, they don't get a mouthful of mud or silt. They're going to have just hard rock, and it's so much easier for them to pin and trap those bait fish against a hard bottom area than a soft bottom area. So these are basically all of your ambush zones. And without the use of forward-facing sonar, you have to basically figure out what those ambush zones are by graphing with your side imaging, marking these when they're offshore, or by marking them with Google Earth like we did here and transferring those waypoints over. The waypoint method works super well, transferring from Google Earth. Again, video link in the description of how to do that. The challenge with that is that if you don't have the entire lake marked up and that zone moves, it's kind of annoying because you won't have all the waypoints you need. Also, not every lake is going to have this perfectly drawn down lake image. Or, like right now on Beaver Lake in Arkansas, the lake is lower than the lowest drawn down image, so all the spots I've marked over the years are useless. So, as a result, I have to go in and side scan all of the areas, mark all the objects, which only maybe takes, I could probably scan this entire area. Let's say you did a pass here, and I guess I can show you that. Like, a lot of times people ask how I would graph an area like this. Usually what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this area, and let's say I'm graphing for bait fish and for objects. I'll just mark through like this and try to make passes because my side scan is set to 100 feet. And let's say I'm in like 10 foot of water. That means I'm still graphing 90 feet on either side of the boat. So I would just go through here like this, and I would try to leave like the distance between these would be, 80 feet. So maybe 70 feet. And then every 70 feet I move over 70 feet. And so there's like 70-foot gaps here. So I'm going to scan this whole thing, and that'll allow me to scan all these stumps. It'll allow me to scan this whole roadbed. And I'm just going to mark as I go, mark everything I see. And then once I get into a zone where there's a good amount of bait fish, I'll already have all of this stuff marked while I'm graphing for the bait fish, kind of multitasking. And now I have all of those things we marked earlier marked, and we're good to go. It takes about maybe 20-30 minutes, but that 20-30 minutes of graphing, maybe an hour to graph all of this, will set you up with a really key zone and a lot of objects to fish. So if you're out there for 4 hours, you spend an hour kind of getting prepared, graphing, finding the fish, getting organized, and then you spend 3 hours actually throwing at targets and actually fishing, rather than just, randomly going into this pocket and just start fishing the bank, which is what everyone else does, and you're going to have to fish behind 10 other anglers for pressured fish that just are getting way too much pressure. So instead, by going to like this no man's land, these big flats, these big random areas, even though those fish are moving and roaming and stuff like that, there is a method to potentially predict where they're going to feed and get those fish in the boat a little bit more effectively than the other anglers on the lake. So hopefully that makes sense, guys. There's these no man's land areas are all over the place. Again, just these bigger flats. You'll find them on lakes all across the country. This isn't just like I'm just talking about a little lake just because the lake's drawn down, but you can do the exact same thing on Lake Dardanelle like we talked last week, where there's random isolated patches of grass and stuff like that in these flats, and we marked those, and you can look at my last video about finding big fish areas. You can do it on a beaver lake or a table rock lake in Missouri, where you have, actually I'll pull up my Navionics here so you guys can see that, or my CMAP. Actually, this is the CMAP mapping. I've got some questions about this. This is actually the CMAP chart viewer. The Navionics app isn't working very well anymore, so if you guys do want to check out mapping online, this is free. Just type in CMap Chart Explorer. It's by Lowrance. It works pretty well. So anyways, if you go to like a Table Rock, same concept applies with this no man's land. It's just you don't want to necessarily go do this like in these really steep banks and things like that. But if you do it on like a big flat like out here, and you find that there's bait fish in the area, it can really work really well on a big flat rounded point. But if there's no bait fish around, don't mess with it. And don't try to like find those same things on these really steep, drop off steep banks. You want a bigger, flatter area, which usually means kind of running around the lake and finding these flatter zones, these big flats here. Here's a big flat. Depends on the, obviously the depth of water you want to fish and all those things. Most of the time you're going to find that there's more flats further up the river arms on like a lake like a Table Rock or a Beaver or something. And you can look on the map and find, again, bigger bays, bigger flats. This is kind of the zones I would try this strategy for more, rather than like in a sharp pocket like this. Like you're not going to have much success finding flats when there's no flats. But in a big bay like this, there's a lot of potential here, and you can graph this bay and graph this bay, find where the majority of those bait fish are in this one or maybe this one over here, and then okay, they're in this right here. I'm going to mark all those areas like we talked about, and we're going to go fishing. So that's kind of how I do it. You have to pick section of the lake on bigger lakes to kind of match this pattern and find no man's land. You can't fish no man's land on a super steep bank unless you're trying to fish out here actually in the middle of the creek channel, and that's like still considered, I guess, no man's land, but that's 100% a forward facing sonar thing. So if you guys want me to talk about that, I mean, there's really not much to say. It's just get out in the middle of the channel, graph until you find bait, and figure out which bait balls have fish on them. It's not a very complicated strategy, to be honest, but it's what's dominating pro fishing, much to my annoyance at times, because I feel like it's not very there's not a lot of strategy that goes into it, not as much thought. It's just get out here in the middle of the creek and just throw around until you see fish. But that's neither here nor there. There is some strategy to it, but I like what we talked about in this video a lot more. So anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode of Bass Fishing Declassified. I'm gonna get off my soapbox now before I go on for another hour about it. But if you guys do enjoy this content, again, make sure you download the Fish the Moment podcast. We have all these episodes from Bass Fishing Declassified, as well as Fish the Moment YouTube channel and old Fish the Moment videos from the past. We put all the audio there so you guys can listen to those while you go to the lake, while you're at the gym, while you're in the office, anything like that. So definitely check that out. Otherwise, thanks for checking out this video. We'll see you on the next one.